Hi, Com 201. I'm Professor Brooks back again, and welcome to your first Friday YouTube video. This one won't be too long, not as long as some of the other ones that are to come later on in this term, but as with many college classes, we're going to be starting a lot of our learning off with theory, which is what we're going to get today. It's good to get the concepts and understand how the basics work before we jump into the skills. So if you've read chapter 1, you already have an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. But if you haven't, this will give you a good foundation. Still go ahead and read chapter 1. It's full of good stuff, and it'll really reinforce some of the ideas we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to share my screen. There's that. I'm going to from the current slide, please. And so what we're going to be talking about and learning about today is the speech communication process. Now, it's interesting. It does have to do with public speaking, and that's why we call it the speech communication process. But generally, this refers to any communication process, how a message is sent from one entity to another, and all of the different variables that are involved in that scenario. And as I describe the process, we're going to be talking about all the different ways that the variables, when you change them, how messages can be more easily understood or inhibited from being understood. It's a very interesting process. We always talk about it in communication classes. So if you take other communication classes, just know this is probably going to come up again. All right, so if there is something that needs to be communicated, what is the first thing you need? You usually need someone who wants to communicate. And in our case today, we're going to call it the speaker. Now, while we're talking about verbal speech, because this is a public speaking class, really with any communication process, a speaker doesn't necessarily have to be speaking verbally. You can be communicating non-verbally. If I go, that is a message. It's either hello or hey, I'm trying to get your attention, but I didn't have to say anything. You could kind of understand what I might be trying to say. A message could be conveyed electronically through TV, through radio, through a computer, through an email, through a letter. But you need somebody or some entity who has a message, something they want to convey. Now, with public speaking, it is something that we want to say, but if we're generalizing this communication process again, the message could be conveyed any number of ways. So first thing you have is a speaker. That speaker has something they want to communicate, and that communication is called a message. Now, generally, when I speak, for example, if I'm having a conversation with somebody, I might have several messages, but when we're talking about speeches, generally there is one overarching message, and that refers to whatever our specific purpose and our specific needs are, what we are trying to say specifically in the speech. We might have a lot of words we use to get to that general, that very specific idea. However, generally, we're talking about one message that's going to be coming out in a public speaking speech situation. So we have a speaker, that person has a message, and it doesn't stop there, does it? Because what else do you need? If I'm just here and I have a communication and I'm talking, it does nothing unless there is a listener. Now, once again, this implies verbal communication because we were in public speaking class, but this person could be called an audience member or the audience as well, if it's a group. I prefer audience in a lot of ways because when it comes to a speaker delivering a message, this could be happening in a variety of ways. And for example, if I'm giving nonverbal communication, remember that? Well, you're not really listening to that, are you? You're observing it happening. You're an audience to my waiting. So even though our book is going to call it a listener, and when we give a speech, the people who are hearing the speech are listeners, this is part of our process. Generally, the speaker, the communicator delivering a message would go to an audience member. So we could use those kind of equivocal terms for this part of the process so far. Hopefully you're with me. All right, so a speaker has a message and they want that message to be conveyed to the listener. Now, how does that happen? That happens through a channel. The channel is basically the method or the medium that is used to convey the message. So if I'm speaking to you directly, our channel is a face-to-face communication. Now, I actually am speaking to you by YouTube video. So I'm the speaker here. My message here is our lesson. You are my listener, but what is my channel? My channel is the video. Hopefully this is all making sense. If I am a newscaster and I'm reading the news to you and you are watching, the channel is television. If I'm speaking to you as a disc jockey and you're listening, you're hearing my words, the channel is radio. If I write an email and you receive it, the channel that you receive the email, that message is email. So sometimes they can be e-communication, sometimes they can be media, and sometimes they can be just face-to-face communication. The channel, though, is the method or the medium by which the message is sent. So a speaker delivers a message to a listener through a channel, and the listener doesn't just sit there blank. The listener or the audience member will do things, whether nonverbal or verbal, that let the speaker know how they are receiving the message, or if they're receiving the message, whether they understand the message, whether they don't understand the message. And this is called feedback. There is always feedback in a speech communication process. So sometimes, if someone asks you, well, how did it go? And someone says, I have no idea. You probably do have a good idea because if you were looking at the listener, if you were looking at your audience, if they're just looking at you blankly, like they don't understand, that in itself is feedback. It looked like they didn't understand what I was talking about. Or, gosh, they were very intent listening to what I was saying. That's feedback too. They were totally listening to what I was saying. That tells you, they are very serious about what they're hearing from you. Sometimes feedback can be immediate. So if I'm talking to you in a face-to-face conversation and you tell me something juicy and gossipy and I go, that's feedback. Like, I'm surprised or I'm shocked, but it happened immediately. Sometimes feedback can be delayed, and that occurs a lot with media or with e-communication. Let's say I send an email to you that says, hey, there's a pop quiz and you need to go to our Moodle page and take this test before the day is out. Your response might be to send me an email going, oh, Ms. Brooks, please, I'm not ready for a quiz. That is feedback to me that lets me know what you're thinking. And it didn't happen immediately. You had to send the email back and I had to read it before I found out your feedback. Maybe it was such a fun pop quiz. Everybody gets an A, A's across the board. And that, in fact, is feedback to me, letting me know, hey, you all studied, you did a great job, and I'm an awesome teacher. Those are all messages that come through communication. So feedback can be delayed, it can be instantaneous, it can be nonverbal, it can be verbal. If you ask me a question and I answer it, my answer, if it pertains to what you are speaking about, is indeed feedback. But it can also be a message to you to be a listener for, and then you give me feedback with your comment and so forth and so on. So it could be verbal, it can be written communication. It can be in the form of ratings. If we're talking about the media, TV or radio, how many listeners do we have? Those are all ratings and shares. Sometimes it can be in the form of likes or emojis if we're talking about e-communication or social media. So there are so many different types of feedback, but it's always happening and it always needs to be paid attention to. We're good? All right, so let's keep going. Interference, when we're talking about the process, is anything that impedes the sending of a message from a speaker to a listener, or impedes feedback from getting from a listener to a speaker. It's any part of the environment or any part of the message, anything the speaker does or the listener does that prevents the message from getting through clearly, or feedback from getting through clearly. So let's think about that for a second. Let's say that we're in class and I am teaching and I have a message that we're going to have a pop quiz next Tuesday. And so I'm telling you all about it. I'm the speaker. My message is, hey, there's a pop quiz next Tuesday. Note to all y'all, there's not a pop quiz. This is just an example. So message is, there's a pop quiz next Tuesday. You all are the listeners or the audience. And let's say while I'm talking, a whole group of people is out in the hallway and they're talking super loud. They're walking around. They're being really disruptive. And you're trying to focus on me, but there's so much laughing and commotion and walking and stomping going out in the hallway. Everybody in the audience, all of you, start looking to see what's going on out in the hallway. You know, that is interference. Why? Because I'm trying to tell you about our pop quiz and what you might expect. If I'm telling you about the pop quiz, it's not really pop, is it? Let's say there's a quiz. So I'm trying to tell you about the quiz coming up on Tuesday, but you're being distracted. And let's say later on, you're like, oh, we have a quiz on Tuesday. Did you tell us? And I said, yes, I totally told you, but there was that disruption happening and it probably prevented you from getting all the information you needed. So that's an example of one type of interference. Sometimes it can be physical in your environment, making noise, being a visual distraction. You know, how many times have you been talking to someone and then one of your friends is kind of in the background being silly and goofy and making faces, and you're like trying to tell them, stop it. But you're not able to focus on the friend who's talking because you have another friend who's a goofball who's distracting you. It can be visual, it can be sound. Sometimes it can be within your own body. Let's say you're in my class and I'm doing such a fantastic job of teaching, but you're super tired. You stayed up until 4 o'clock the night before writing a long paper for another class, and your eyes are just getting super tired and heavy. And is that interference? It definitely is. So your biological processes sometimes can be interference because it's preventing you from focusing your attention upon the message that I'm trying to convey. There are anything that really impedes the message can definitely be interference. Let's talk about e-communication. My internet went down. Ooh, that's definitely interference. If I'm trying to send an email and I hit send and suddenly there's a huge blackout and nobody gets the message for hours and hours and hours, it's interfering with the message getting through to all of my listeners or my audience. A blackout, power outage can definitely be interference for e-communication or media. Let's say I am a newscaster again, and I'm talking about the news and I'm reading it, and it could be in your house, you know, kids running around preventing you from focusing on my program, or it could be interference with the TV itself. My internet, and it has my TV services with it, basically has been doing this really weird thing where just randomly, all of a sudden, the video would just start pop, skip. And I have to basically go turn the TV off, reboot the router, set everything up again, turn it back on, let it get reset, and then I can watch my show. But I missed a big chunk right there. That's definitely interference. And it's not interference that was in my scenario, but it's interference that happened through the medium itself, through the channel of my TV set. So interference, like I said, anything that impedes the message coming from a speaker to a listener or feedback from the listener to a speaker. All of this everything happening is encompassed within a situation. So all of the environment that's around you, if you're having an in-person communication situation, from the room you're in, if you're outside, if you're in a large spaces building or in a tiny little closety room, that situation affects how the communication happens as well. If it's an e-communication, whether or not the message is in a huge, long, super long email, or it's just a few sentences, that's an interesting situation as well. If I'm watching a news program on my smartphone versus watching a news program on my big, huge screen TV in my living room, those are two totally different situations, but the same type of message in a couple of different channels. And whether I'm sitting in my, let's say I'm sitting in my bathtub and I'm watching my smartphone, I'm watching the news, or I'm watching the news in my living room on my big screen TV. Those are two totally different situations, even though the speaker might be the same and the message might be the same, and I'm the listener, I'm the same. The channels are a little bit different. The situation is completely different. And the way that they would receive feedback from me is completely different. And so how the communication gets through and how effective it is going to be different according to whatever situation we're in. So depending upon, let's say I am a politician and I want to say, hey, today we're here to celebrate Georgia Military College's 200th anniversary. I don't know how many years old they are. It's probably not 200 years old, but just go with me on this. And let's say we are in a big auditorium and it's full of students, and I am up on a platform and there's a lectern and I have a microphone. And so I'm the speaker. My message is, today is Georgia Military College's 200th anniversary, and we are all here to celebrate. And you all are the listeners, you're my audience. The channel it's face to face, but it does also go through a microphone. So we got two channels working here. The feedback that could be happening, I would be looking at the audience members and seeing the responses, nonverbal mostly probably on their faces, but people might clap, hooray, we're here to be celebrating. That's feedback as well. Maybe it's super quiet and people are super bored, but they're there for credit. That tells me a lot too with the feedback. But my situation is I'm in this huge auditorium hall. There's probably some reverberation on the walls, which could cause some interference. Maybe people are chatting through the audience. They're whispering to each other. I'm only here for credit. What am I here for? I don't know. Or this is the best thing I've ever been to. It's awesome. If you're hearing people whispering and it's distracting, that could be interference as well. Maybe a lot of people, this is 8 o'clock in the morning. People are still waking up, so they're a little tired in the audience. That's a little bit of interference. Maybe there's lights on me, and so I can't really see the faces of the audience because it's too bright in my eyes. That's impeding the feedback that I'm getting from the audience, the listeners. So that's interference on my feedback. That situation, all those different aspects affect how well that message is getting delivered to the listeners. Now, let's say I'm still the speaker and the message is still, welcome here as we commemorate Georgia Military College's 200th anniversary. You're still the listeners, but let's change the situation. Let's say we're outside and we're in the parking lot. They've set it up with a whole bunch of chairs, and I still have a lectern and a microphone, but it's a hot sunny day. And let's say instead of being 8 o'clock in the morning, let's have it 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Right after lunch, we're having this very special announcement. So we got a totally different situation, but the same speaker, the same message, and the same listener. Channel is still us being somewhat face-to-face, still talking through a microphone. I still am getting feedback from the audience. I can see the looks on people's faces again. I can hear if they clap, if they boo, if they're totally silent. All of that are forms of feedback. But let's take a look at the situation. I'm outside. It's 1 o'clock on a sunny day, so it's probably warm. It's probably hot. And you know where our parking lot is. It's right alongside that roadway. We've got cars back and forth, driving back and forth. And as the cars go back and forth, they make a lot of noise. So if you're sitting there, you're one of the listeners, and it's hot, and you've got cars going back and forth, zoom, 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 and it doesn't let up, that creates a lot of interference, doesn't it? You're trying to focus, but there's all this noise coming, and it's hot. Maybe you just had lunch. Remember, it's 1 o'clock. So if you had a really filling lunch, you might be kind of logy and being like, oh, I shouldn't have eaten 2 burgers for lunch today. All of that is different kinds of interference that could be impeding the message coming from me to you. And the feedback coming back to me, if it's super bright outside, you know, I might be having to wear sunglasses or something. I might be able to see you pretty well, but the feedback I'm getting might be different. You might still be looking tired, but you might be going like this. A whole bunch of people might be fanning themselves. People might be listening, but I think, ooh, this is going terribly because everyone seems to be completely agitated. They're all fanning themselves. They're listening to the cars. I might have to speak really loud, even though I'm using a microphone because of all the car noise. And I might then come across like I'm yelling at people. My message is still the same, but the listener's like, wow, she's really yelling. She really feels dramatically about this anniversary. That could change some of the feedback. And I suddenly think, wow, people are looking like they're confused about what's happening up here, or they're bored with what's happening here. Ugh, let's just go. Let's speed this thing up, you know. I know in both of these cases, a lot of the feedback seemed negative. But, you know, these are things to think about as you prepare for possible speech communication process situations that you undertake. So these are all the 7 aspects of the speech communication process. And before I give you your remote exercise, we're going to go through a few scenarios so you can see how different communication situations in your own life can be broken down into the process so you can think ahead and maybe try to reduce interference from happening in the future. Maybe figure out if one channel might be better than another channel for the message you're trying to convey. What kind of feedback do you hope to get? If you get different kinds of feedback, what might that mean? So let's take a look. Let's move forward. So here's our process. And situation number 1. Let's say you're the HR director of your company. Awesome. And you have to explain a new policy to the employees. It's 1 o'clock p.m., just after the lunch break. Boy, I like to set these scenarios up right after the lunch break, don't I? And everyone is assembled in a large conference room. The policy requires that all staff must wear full business attire every day and not casual business attire. Okay, so that is the scenario. Let's break this down according to our model here. Who is the speaker? Well, you are. Remember, I said you're the HR director. So speaker is you, the HR director. What is the message? In our little scenario, it says, I'm supposed to explain, or you're supposed to explain this policy that requires all staff must wear full business attire every day. And it can't be casual, so no slacks and a nice top. This is full business attire, which generally means suits for men and women. So we got a speaker, we got the message, our listeners. Who are the listeners? The listeners are my employees at my company. What is the channel? Well, let's think about this. So everyone is assembled in a large conference room. What might be available to me to use as a channel? Well, I could just stand up in front of everybody and say, hey, everybody, we have a new policy. And sometimes, you know, I've been at businesses before where That was my channel, was just a really loud voice. If you're in a fancy company, you might have a large conference room that has some audio visual capabilities to it. So you might have a microphone you could use, which would be helpful. That way you don't have to yell and people don't have to strain to hear you. So let's say for the sake of my scenario here, you do have some audio visual capabilities and you're wearing a microphone or you're holding a microphone. So you're able to address everybody. And the channel is not only your voice, but it's the microphone system. So we've got our speaker, our message, our listener. What kind of feedback do you think I might receive from my employees? Let's think about that message there. The policy requires that all staff must wear full business attire. Everybody has to wear suits every day. So I'm planning for the scenario, or I'm thinking about how I would put it together. What kind of feedback do you think I can expect? Probably not going to be great. You know, if everybody's been wearing business casual or casual attire up till this day, and suddenly I lower the boom that, okay, it's suits from here on out every day, 8 to 5, I'm probably going to get some negative feedback. What's that probably going to look like? Well, if I'm making it a large announcement and I'm speaking to everybody, it's probably going to be a lot of, like, did you just hear what she said? Are you kidding? Really? I'm going to get some nonverbal there. I might actually get some verbal. You might get a brave employee that pops up saying, no, seriously, is this actually a policy that we're going to have to be living with from here on out? So somebody might actually have verbal feedback if they can't really believe it. You know, how are we supposed to have suits every day if this has not been required until now? So I need to anticipate, okay, this feedback could be kind of negative. It probably is going to help me shape the message that I deliver. I'm probably going to have to be very skillful in how I relate my message in order to kind of minimize some of that negative feedback. What sorts of interference do you think I could experience in this large conference room? Well, let's think about how large this is and how many employees we might have. These are all things you have to think about. If I have a large company and this is a big, you know, conference room, are people standing? Are they sitting? If they're standing around, you know, sometimes if you stand and someone's talking for at least 15, 20 minutes, people get uncomfortable after a while and it becomes disruptive. Your brain starts to wander. Now, this is important stuff, and honestly, it might be kind of shocking. So I think people's attention would definitely be focused, but you have to expect that, okay, it's probably better for people to be sitting so that they're more comfortable and they can focus better. If it's a small group of employees in my company and we're all seated, that's definitely part of my situation. But what other types of interference could there be? If people are moving around and whispering to each other, you know, they might have heard the beginning of my message, but they're probably not hearing after that, because even in their brains, their internal monologue might be interfering with the rest of my message coming out. If they're thinking, how in the world am I going to be buying all new suits? Or how many suits do I have actually? Some guy who might like to really wear suits might be like, this is my moment. I have 14 suits and I can wear one every day for 2 weeks in a row, even including weekends. This is my time to shine. You know, some guy might like it. Some lady might like it. A lot of people might not. You know, if this is a situation where people had been complaining that everyone's dressing down too much and perhaps people had recommended everybody wear suits, then I might expect good feedback. But from my situation, let's just say people were expecting negative feedback. So people's internal monologues could definitely interfere with a message getting through. People whispering to each other or, you know, doing nonverbal even to each other. If I'm focusing on my friend who's going, I'm not focusing on the speaker and their message, which means that's interference as well. And the situation is pretty much everything I've been talking about regarding that large conference room, the audio visual capability, people, whether they're seated or whether they're standing, all of that goes into the situation. And you can kind of see if I'm planning this sort of communication, this message, thinking about all of these things in advance can kind of help me figure out how I want to say the message, how I can minimize interference, how I can pick the best channel to use, how I can anticipate feedback. Make sense? All right, let's try this again, and I'll give you some time to think about this one. All right, so scenario number 2. A local politician has set up a news conference to announce his candidacy for state office. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so the media have time to write up the story for the 6 o'clock news, and only members of the media and the politician's closest supporters are present at the event on the State House steps. So think about this. So who is the speaker? If you said the local politician, you're on track. And what is the message that the speaker wants to convey? Yep, it's right there in my little scenario. The politician wants to announce his candidacy for state office. So we've got the speaker, we've got the message. Who are the listeners? This is a trick one. So the immediate listeners right on the scene are definitely, if you're reading the scenario, members of the media and the politician's closest supporters. So if you said that, you're still on track. But let's think about this. What is the whole point of a news conference? Aha, this message needs to be relayed to the viewing public of those media organizations. So whether they're radio or TV journalists, they're going to be shooting video or recording audio or taking photographs and then delivering that message in a secondary way to a secondary listener group or a secondary audience, which are the media viewing public. Aha, we've got 2 sets of listeners. So, you know, and honestly, if you're talking about 2 different groups of listeners, you have your immediate group who are the media and the close supporters, and then you have the media viewers who are the secondary audience. There's all sorts of different channels that pertain to each audience, and then feedback that pertains to each audience, and interference that pertains to each audience. If we're talking about the immediate audience, the immediate listeners, the channel could be basically the microphone set up. He's got the podium, he's got his microphone, he's talking out there, but he's also talking face to face with them. And they're hearing him verbally right there on the scene. If we're talking about the secondary audience of the media viewers, their channel could be radio, their channel could be television, their channel could be newspaper, their channel could be the internet, a web page that lists the story about this politician and his announcement. So depending upon the audience, we have a whole different channel, and there's all different ways that feedback can get from each audience to the speaker. In the immediate audience, it's kind of funny. The media, they might respond and give feedback by asking questions. When he talks, they might all of a sudden start writing. And so he knows, aha, I said something that makes them interested. That probably was good to say. Or if they just kind of stand there watching like, you haven't said anything interesting, that tells the politician, I need to think of something interesting to say, or I need to get to the good part of my speech. The closest supporters, though, you know, remember I told you they tend to get used, they get brought in to cheer. So it makes it seem like the politician's super popular. So if the politician's closest supporters are all cheering, yay, that's feedback. Now, is it truthful feedback? Well, it probably is, because if they're close supporters, they're probably like, this is awesome. He thinks this is going great. They're all responding so well, but they were brought in because they would be responding well. So it makes him feel confident. His message comes out as more confident, and it's a loop you've got going there. If we're talking about that secondary audience of people watching through the media or through the computer, their feedback is going to be a little more delayed. So maybe after the story breaks, you start seeing all the comments coming down through social media and through the web pages. People might be writing letters to the editor, or they might call the TV or radio station and say, I don't know what I think about him. He really seemed kind of fake with all his weird cheering people around him. Or maybe they were like, wow, that audience really was going for him. I bet this is a huge new movement to support that politician. And he seems like he's a real up and comer. There's all sorts of ways feedback could come from that secondary audience. So not only the immediate feedback on the scene, but that delayed feedback coming from those media audiences, all coming back to the speaker. Interference, let's say, we're saying he's outside and he's only members, they're on the State House steps. So what sorts of interference could there be? Well, if it's super sunny, it could be hot, maybe it's raining. Bad weather is always an interference when it comes to communication. The State House steps tend to be a little bit removed from traffic, but nonetheless, you probably do have some noise in the background. If you have all these supporters standing around, maybe they're holding signs, maybe they're just milling about, they might make noise, they might distract each other, that kind of thing can be interfering. Plus, if you have all these media people standing around the politician, and then you have him surrounded by his supporters, the media people doing what they do could be distracting to not only the listener, but to other people in that audience, the people standing around the supporters. Interference from that secondary audience, gosh, it could be all sorts of things. If you're watching at home, maybe you've got kids running around in your living room. If you're listening and you're driving, listening to the radio, trying to hear the story and you're driving, driving, there is the interference, even though honestly, the distraction is to your driving and it's the radio. That's a whole sidebar. Interference can come if let's say I'm reading it on a web page and those stupid ads pop up, or all sorts of things happen while maybe an email pops up while I'm reading it. That's interference. It's going to prevent me from being really focused on that message that I'm reading about this news story. And the situation is whatever happens to be where I am, if I'm one of those media observers, if I'm in my car listening on the radio, if I'm at home watching on TV, if I'm at my workplace and I happen to see the story on my lunch break while I'm on my computer, everybody's situation can be different if I'm one of those media observers and I'm that group of the audience. If I'm on the scene, the situation is the State House steps outside, being hot, with traffic nearby, surrounded by media and supporters. So I know it gets a little complicated, doesn't it? But these are all things to think about. If I'm that politician and I'm planning this ahead and I'm like, okay, here's my message. I have two audiences. I have people on the scene who are going to want a good speech, and I've got media who are really going to want some good sound bites to share because that's going to help them get good ratings. I need to think about the people at home. What are they going to be listening for? The media is going to be cutting up my speech into sound bites. I need to make sure that what they get is good. So thinking ahead and using this process can help you shape your message. And maybe if you thought about it, maybe the State House steps aren't the best place to have this after all. Let's say if it looks like rain, ooh, that's a terrible place, because that would definitely be interference. Maybe we should do it inside somewhere. State House steps, though, give you a really good background and make you look influential and political. So if it's a sunny day, it's spring, you've got plenty of space, it looks like it's going to be an awesome scenario for you, then the State House steps make a great situation. Things to think about while you're preparing to communicate. All right, that was a long one, wasn't it? Let's go forward. Oh, it's another one. So many scenarios. Okay, in this scenario, a parent of two young children is addressing her kids' elementary school's PTA with concerns about a new fundraiser where all the children are required to raise at least $250 each by selling wrapping paper. We've all been there, haven't we? She thinks the task is too difficult for kids and families. So, interesting thing about this communication process, it's not a public speaking. It isn't. Oh, it is a public speaking situation, isn't it? I know. Y'all were like, well, kind of is. You were right. I almost goofed up there. I almost had to start this video again. But just to let you know, it doesn't have to be somebody influential, it doesn't, HR director or politician. This is just a parent of two young kids who happens to be at the PTA meeting where they talk about this fundraiser saying all kids, we need new uniforms for the band and the football team needs a new trailer and such kids need new uniforms. So all the kids are going to have to raise at least $250 each by selling wrapping paper. And she's sitting there going, how is my first and second grader going to sell $500 together worth of wrapping paper? So she's going to stand up. Okay, who's the speaker? Speaker is parent. What is the message? Having all of these kids raise at least $250 by selling wrapping paper is going to be very difficult. Makes sense, doesn't it? Who are the listeners? Listeners are the other members of the PTA. And if you've ever been to a PTA meeting, a lot of times they have, the board members of the PTA sitting up front. So she might be addressing the message to those board members, the people who are making the announcements. But also she wants to voice her opinion so that all the other PTA members can hear it as well. And maybe they can be in agreement with her. Or maybe she'll hear that we still need to raise the money and this is the best way to do it. So the listeners are not only people surrounding her in the PTA, but the board members up front. Anybody who happens to be in that space is a listener. What is the channel? The channel is probably her own voice, unless it's one of those situations where you can go up to a microphone or you go up in front of everybody and speak. But generally, these PTA meetings tend to be where people just kind of yell out. So channel is her own voice. Feedback. She might get, like I said, positive feedback, and it might be nonverbal or verbal from the people surrounding her. Maybe people are like, she is right. This is going to be really tough. If you have 3 or 4 kids, that means you're selling $750 to $1,000 worth of wrapping paper. That's crazy. But people might be negative to it. They might be like, we really have to raise the money. We've looked at a whole bunch of different fundraisers. There's no way we can, have enough pancake breakfasts and other fundraisers that could raise this kind of money. And wrapping paper seems to be the way we're doing it. But feedback might also be, it might be positive, might be negative, might be, maybe people are tired. Maybe this is the end of the meeting and people are yawning and kids are running around and people are ready to go home. It tells her that, okay, I need to speed this up maybe. So channel is her voice. Feedback can be positive, can be negative. Maybe the board people up front are negative, but the people around her are positive to her message. So you've got a conflict there. That's interesting. Interference. Well, if you're in an elementary school cafegimatorium situation, where they have the cafeteria and the gym and the auditorium is all one big space and it's all full of tile, the sound quality is probably not going to be great. And if she doesn't have a microphone, she's going to have to yell so people can hear. If you've got a whole bunch of parents there, some of them brought their kids and kids are going to be running around or whispering or fidgeting, and that can be interference as well. Maybe some of the feedback, if people are like, she's right, and she keeps talking, but the clapping is kind of impeding some of what she's saying. That could be interference as well. The situation as a whole is this auditorium or the cafegimatorium, full of people, and you've got the echoing noise. There's no AV there. That's helpful. If people are standing, that's one kind of situation. If people are seated, that's a whole other type of situation. Now, this is one of those spontaneous situations where perhaps she doesn't have a whole lot of time to think about how she's going to say this. Maybe she's at the PTA meeting and they just released this information about the fundraiser. So she's sitting in her chair. Does she have a lot of time to put together the process? Maybe she has a little bit of time and she can sit there and think, okay, what's the best way for me to say this? So that with my voice as it is, maybe I need to keep it short and sweet and maybe not go on for a long time. Maybe I say a couple of things, and depending upon the feedback I get, if it's super in agreement with me, I keep going. But if it's super against me, I kind of back off and say, that's just what I'm saying. So, even if it's something that seems to be a spontaneous communication situation, there's always time for a couple of minutes of planning ahead to really kind of make the most of your message. Does that make sense? Gotcha. All right, one more. I did 4. Can you believe it? Last one. A teenager is presenting his case to his parents on why he should be allowed to get a part-time job. He wants the job so he can raise money to buy a used car. They're at their kitchen table and it's nearly dinner time. Now, is this a public speaking situation? I would say no. Why? Because it's just a teenager talking to his parents. This is not a situation where he has to have an address. It's more like a conversation. And I know we talked in the last class about, can a conversation be a public speaking situation? Let's just say, for the sake of this scenario, it's not. It's just a conversation. So even situations that are not public speaking can use the speech communication process for planning. So who's the speaker? Teenager. What is the message? The message is, I should be allowed to get a part-time job because I want to raise my own money to buy a used car. Who's the listener? Read down there. Yep, you're right. His parents. And what's the channel going to be? Channel is probably going to be verbal if, he wants them to sit down and he wants to talk about it. What kind of feedback should the kid plan on? Well, this is where he's going to have to think and, about previous experiences, maybe he's proved himself to be super reliable and responsible. So he says, okay, maybe if the feedback seems pretty positive, I can use that confidence to really make my case. Maybe he's had some situations in the past where he hasn't been super responsible. He's been grounded a few times. He still really wants this part-time job though. So he's thinking, okay, from my previous experiences, this might be a hard sell. Might have to work on my message a little bit to overcome that. Might have to talk about, I've learned from my previous experiences and I'm ready to be responsible. Maybe that's part of my message. So he's thinking about possible feedback. What sorts of interference might there be? Well, let's think about the situation first. They're in the kitchen table. So honestly, he's going to be face-to-face pretty close to them. Pretty decent if you're going to have a conversation. It's nearly dinner time though. So what's happening? Either mom is cooking in the background or she started cooking and now they're all sitting. Her brain might be on, is that casserole burning? Or did I start things when I should have? Does it smell like things are cooking properly? What's happening in the microwave? Is it about to ding? So there might be some mental processes with whoever was cooking dinner that might be acting as interference. Maybe they're hungry. It's been a long day and the son says, I'd like to talk to you before we start making dinner. And this shouldn't take long. Well, they're hungry. They're like, okay, let's go. Come on. We don't have all, time is dinner, let's go. So maybe they're being hungry, growling stomach interferes with them from listening to him as clearly as they might, just because they're focused on the fact that, dinner is right over there and we can't have it yet. So depending upon, if someone's making dinner, if they're hungry for dinner, what else could be happening in the kitchen? Maybe he's got younger siblings and they're running in and out of the kitchen. That can be interference. So the situation, depending upon if it's just the parents and the teenager, if there's other kids, is there a TV on in the background? Does someone make a call? Does someone have their cell phone and they keep looking at it from time to time? All of those things can be interference. So if I'm the teenager and I'm trying to think in advance of how I'm going to set up the scenario, I might, maybe I don't wait until it's just about dinner time before I have my little talk with my parents. Maybe I wait till after we eat. That might prompt me, delay a little bit. And then we sit down when everyone's feeling okay. Maybe we don't have it at the kitchen table. Maybe we have it in the living room and we can be more focused. Maybe if he's thinking, he's like, face to face is not my best, strongest suit. Maybe I should write down some notes, or maybe I write them, a letter and say, here's what I want to do. I want you to read this and then we can discuss it. Depending upon how the teenager thinks they communicate best, could change the channel. And I don't mean on TV, but he could switch up from having a verbal conversation to having a written conversation, or at least starting written and then going to verbal. So he could change the situation, could change the channel, depending upon the feedback that he might anticipate. He could change how he does the message. But if this teenager is thinking in advance about all the parts of this process and how he wants to persuade his parents to let him get this job, he can try to shape everything to his best advantage. And that's kind of the thing here. You can always use this process not only to plan how to really create an advantageous communication situation, but sometimes you can also review it. Say, okay, let's think about what we just did. How well was that? Oof, I didn't anticipate the situation would be as full of interference as it was. So maybe going forward, I change a couple of variables. Maybe according to the feedback, you're like, ugh, the way I said that was just wrong. Maybe I had the wrong channel. Maybe my message needs to be reshaped, needs to be rewritten. So not only in preparing, but in reviewing and learning from experience, this process is valuable in a lot of ways. All right. Did you learn enough about the speech communication process? I hope you did, because we have our remote exercise. And let me do this. The speech communication process in real life situations. Are you ready? Take some notes or take a picture. Ta-da! This remote exercise is going to be due Sunday, January 23rd, which is just this Sunday, by 11:59 p.m. If you turn it in midnight Monday, it's too late, because the Moodle link will just go pop and you won't be able to submit. But you will turn it in through our Moodle page. You'll click on the link and you'll need to have done this exercise in a Word document that you can upload into the link, submit properly. In that Word document, you do want to put in the top left-hand side your name, below it, Communication 201, and below it, the date. Just helps me figure out, sometimes people turn things in without their names on them, and then I have to go out of the document and go, okay, this is Bob, thank you, Bob, let me go back in. And the date just helps me figure out, it also helps me figure out, when did they do this? Because sometimes I'm like, wow, this thing is scarce. Which data? Oh, they did this Sunday. They didn't do it Monday. I can tell. So anyhow, you're going to put your name, Communication 201, date, and the actual exercise. I want you to write 4 speech communication experiences you've had in your life. And for each one of those 4, explain each part according to the speech communication process. So for these 4 experiences, I want you to list who the speaker was, who the listener or audience was. Maybe there's more than one audience. Remember that politician had an immediate audience and then a delayed reaction audience in the media viewers. I want you to say what the message is or was. I want you to say what the channel was. I want you to say what the feedback was, and not just one thing. Usually there's a variety of feedback. I want you to list what the interference was. And once again, not just one thing, because there's rarely just one bit of interference. And then I want you to describe the situation. So for all these 4 communication experiences, I want you to list all 7 parts of the process. Now, here's where it gets fun. One of those experiences should pertain to a public speaking situation. So maybe you gave a presentation in high school or another college class. Maybe you were in church and you had to read a passage. Maybe you were in a meeting and you had to address a group of fellow employees or neighbors or whatever. One of those experiences should be about public speaking. One of the experiences should pertain to a verbal conversation you had. So let's forget like what we said last week about sometimes public speaking can be conversations and conversation, even though that is true. And philosophically, I like where we were going with that. But let's just say it's a verbal conversation you had with a person or a group, and list those 7 elements. One experience should pertain to an e-communication. Ooh, so like an email, maybe it's a live streaming situation. Maybe it is, gosh, there's a whole bunch of e-communications you can have. Be creative. Think of some sort of e-communication you had and take apart all those 7 elements of the process. And then the final experience should pertain to a communication that was nonverbal. Now, remember at the beginning, I said because we're talking about public speaking, we call it the speech communication process, and we have a speaker and we have a listener. But this can pertain pretty much to any communication situation. And remember I said, who's the speaker? Who's the viewer or the audience? What's the message? Say it's waving, but the message might have been hello, or it might have been, hey, I'm trying to get your attention. And I want you to once again outline all the 7 aspects of that: the situation, the channel, the feedback, the interference, the situation. So you got 4 different situations. They need to be all 4 of these things, 1 of each, 7 elements to each one. Gosh, 28 different things to write about. Wow. And honestly, this is not hard. I don't think you'll have any trouble doing this assignment in any short amount of time. You just have to think of the actual experiences, break them down. And while you're breaking them down, maybe think, I wonder what would happen if this had been happening, or if it had been in a different scenario, a different situation, or maybe if we'd had other interference, or gosh, what if we hadn't had that interference? How would it have been different in this whole scenario that we're talking about? Discovering how all of these different pieces interact to help or hinder communication from happening. So that is your remote exercise. Don't forget to turn it in a Word document uploaded by Sunday at 11:59. You can email me or text me if you have any questions or concerns in the meantime. If you're going to call me or email me or text me just to go, hey, here's my scenario, is this good? Don't do that. Just go with what you think is good, just because I'll be like, sure it is, and that's just going to waste your time and mine. If it's an actual experience that pertains to a public speaking situation or a verbal conversation, just go with that. Otherwise, if you have a real question that's impeding you from finishing your assignment, absolutely text me, call me, whatever. I'm really looking forward to reading your responses, and I will see you next on Tuesday evening, right on time at 6 o'clock. So have a great weekend. Contact me if you need to, and I'll see you later.